Well, throughout his life, Bryan had maintained faith in God and in the people. These were apparently disparate strands of thought and action, that liberal reformer and conservative fundamentalist, but they weren't contradictory because his anti-evolutionism and his progressivism supported reform. Sometimes people are surprised to hear that. Bryan was a reformer, a progressive? Yes, he was. Again, that's part of the injustice that's done to his legacy by the Scopes trial. There was much more substance there than what we get in those scenes that Inherit the Wind. It was the social consequences of Darwinism in particular that bothered Bryan. You've all heard of it, social Darwinism. This was what he was really after. He never really comes out and says that natural selection or evolution is untrue. But social Darwinism is really worthy of attack. It doesn't apply to human society. It's understandable, again, in the wake of World War I, which was then called the War to End All Wars, horrific death, with help of great new weaponry and technology, modernism. Things are really looking ugly in the world. Well, the political reformer and this fundamentalist preacher in Bryan both found this common enemy in evolution. The common enemy inasmuch as it erodes faith in God, according to Bryan. And he thought this in turn would discourage efforts on the part of people to build a better world. In other words, the surrender to determinism. There's no point in trying to improve things. Things are pretty much set the way they are, so give it up and go on. Well, as you know, Scopes was convicted and he was fined $100. And just 5 days after the trial, Bryan made his most significant contribution to the anti-evolution cause. He died. So in the days following the trial, he had worked on polishing and expanding his anti-evolution speech. On Saturday, after the trial, he delivered part of the speech to crowds in Jasper and Winchester, Tennessee. He received very enthusiastic responses each time. He returned to Dayton on Sunday, led prayer at the Methodist Church South, returned to the private residence where he'd stayed during the trial. After lunch, he took a nap and died in his sleep. This is when he became a martyr for the cause. Mencken quipped that we killed the, I paraphrase, SOB. But it was a botched slang because Bryan's death is what gave new life to his ideas and belief. Shortly after his death, efforts were started to build a university in Dayton based on fundamentalist theology and as a memorial to Bryan. It's there to this day, Bryan College. Well, I mentioned the judge had imposed a sentence and a $100 fine. That was an error because the defense had agreed to let the judge fix the penalty, but the state constitution required that the jury impose the penalty. On appeal, the state Supreme Court seized upon that technicality to reverse the judgment against Scopes. So there was no case to be taken to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is what Darrow wanted. You've got to understand, Darrow wanted a conviction of the person he was defending. And as an aside, let me add here that as you look at the cast of characters here, I have a difficult time finding heroes. I think a lot of these people, from Bryan to Darrow to the local attorneys, the local townspeople in their action, do some pretty ugly things. Scopes is probably the least culpable of anybody in the group because he's just dragged along for the ride. Well, in a written opinion, the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court said, "We see nothing to be gained by prolonging the life of this bizarre case." And that ended it. In fact, he even noted that dropping the case might help restore some dignity to the state. Well, the Butler Act was finally repealed in 1967. But the fight wasn't over. In 1974, Tennessee lawmakers required equal emphasis be given in biology text for various theories of origins. The alternate, of course, meant Genesis as a theory of origins. Arkansas and Louisiana enacted similar legislation in 1981. It came back to the Tennessee legislature in 1996, equal time rules. But actually, all of this legislation, all of the posturing, all of the speaking, is framed by the Scopes trial. The Scopes trial sets this up, this evolution issue, as either or. It will be fundamentalist Christianity or evolutionism. It carries to this day. Tennessee's legacy, of course, is that how many times have you seen this come up in Kansas, Louisiana, in Arkansas, in California, where, by the way, the Creation Research Institute is housed, but it's called Scopes 2. So Scopes casts a long shadow over this kind of legislation. The bill in 1996, by the way, said, "No teacher or administrator in a local education agency shall teach the theory of evolution except as a scientific theory." End of quote. Again, for those of you who have a science background, most scientists would look at that and say, of course that's how we're teaching it. Well, evolution is a fact. Natural selection is a theory. But that's how all of the ideas are taught about science. They are theories. You support them with evidence, you disprove them with evidence. But calling creationism a theory is what's been problematic. And of course, it's been an attempt to dodge the First Amendment all along. Well, like life itself, the controversy simply doesn't stop. It just keeps evolving. And one historian summarized the consequences of the trial a few decades after it ended. The drugstore loafers had accomplished their purpose. Dayton was on the map, and Tennessee had become the laughingstock of much of the Western world. A fundamentalist died in Dayton in 1925, but fundamentalism did not. Scopes did lose in Dayton. Science didn't. I think Tennessee lost.
We're going to have a question and answer session now, and I would ask you, because this is being televised, if you have a question to go to the microphone in the back there where the podium is there, so that your questions can be on the mic.
I must have annoyed somebody with those remarks.
When we celebrated I think it was the 75th anniversary or something just recently, I read a long article in Commonweal how Scopes went on to teach at the University of Chicago or somewhere up north. I can't remember where it was. And besides making the point that the Supreme Court kind of just took the wind out of Darrow's sails and didn't let him appeal by that reversal, that book he was defending, that Scopes was teaching out of, that had the theory in it, was quite a racist book, that it said that blacks had not developed like the white race. Are you acquainted with that particular textbook on that point?
I'm not familiar with the textbooks detailed to that extent, but I can tell you such material was common in biology books of the era. Don't forget, this is the 1920s. The eugenics movement is going full steam, and the movement is, of course, the one that has racial differentiation because of genetic differences. This is what comes to full bloom in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. But the American Eugenics Society had been formed earlier and was quite strong, quite influential among, and a lot of